And until next time, I screwed that up, Liz. Welcome to Exploring Genetics, YouTube. Good morning to everyone. Today, our topic is inbreeding. I've got a couple of topics. I even wrote it down on a little card here that I really want to go over with inbreeding. First, some cons, right? Why do I have George out? We're going to go over these things. Then we're going to talk about the pros of inbreeding. Yes, there are some pros to inbreeding. And then, right at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role I think inbreeding plays in the divide between people who hate morphs in their reptiles and people who love them, like me. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, let's talk about the cons, okay? One of the major cons is the social stigma. People hear inbreeding and they are picturing a mutant freak animal with 12 legs and no eyes, and they're like, oh, inbreeding, it messes things up genetically, right? So that's one problem. You're going to upset some people if you practice inbreeding. You just are. There's a lot of people who don't understand everything about inbreeding, or people who only understand the negative parts of inbreeding, and they just assume it's bad, 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 bad. There's no place for it, and if you are a breeder who practices inbreeding, I'm going to avoid you, I'm going to blacklist you, and no one should ever buy from you again, right? So that's one problem with inbreeding. The other con, the biological reason that there's a con to inbreeding, one of them at least, to me the major one, is deleterious recessive traits, okay? Deleterious recessive genes or traits means any gene that is recessive, where you need a homozygous version or a copy from both parents in order to display that phenotype, in order for that gene to show physically, that is deleterious, that is bad, that has some sort of negative effect on the health or survivability or reproductive capability of your animal, okay? So, I have George here. He is an eastern indigo snake, Drymarchon cooperi, right? This species is known to have some problems if you breed two closely related animals together. The offspring might have some issues. So, Victor Herrick, the guy we bought these beautiful little snakes from, he actually had his snakes tested, genetically tested, all of his breeding stock, or many of them, to determine how closely related are they. The technical term that we're looking for is, what is their inbreeding coefficient? Which is really just a measure of how closely related are the parents, right? Were they third cousins and you're not that concerned? Or was it like a parent-child or a sibling to sibling, and then you're going to be pretty concerned? So he has worked extremely hard to have as diverse a group of Drymarchon that he possibly can, right? Now, there's some challenges. There's a reason that these guys are inbred sometimes, because there's not very many of them being bred in captivity. There's not very many of them in captivity, right? When the population is small, logically speaking, it's going to be harder to have unrelated parentage, right? Your likelihood of having a high inbreeding coefficient goes up. And that's not necessarily desirable, right? So what are these deleterious recessive traits? That would mean that a gene that is bad, that is deleterious, that has some sort of either deadly or at least weakening effect on the individual animal, if it is a dominant gene or incomplete dominant gene, it's going to harm every single animal that it ever gets into, right? Which means that it's usually going to breed itself out of existence. Because if it's a dominant trait and it's hurting an animal every time it's in it, those animals are not going to survive very well, right? And over time, usually over a short period of time, that trait will just go away because those individuals will not successfully reproduce and pass that trait on. However, when it's recessive, oftentimes that trait persists in the population because it can be a het, right? If it's in its heterozygous form, it's not hurting that individual animal. And it can keep passing on down through the lines. Well, say you have a male snake. Let's pretend that George here, and I don't think he has any of these problem genes. He's a perfect, beautiful snake from a very responsible breeder. But pretend he had some floating around in his genetics, some gene that is bad, that's going to hurt future generations, right? And it's recessive. And say he's only a het. So we'll call him het for bad gene. Well, if you breed him to any regular female who doesn't carry that trait, it's recessive, so you're fine. None of the offspring are actually going to show that trait and be harmed by it. But what if you keep a male and a female back from that clutch of babies, and you breed them together, and both of them happened to carry that trait in its heterozygous form? Well, in that case, 25% of their offspring, statistically speaking, are going to be homozygous. They're going to be visuals, what we call it in the reptile trade, right? And that's not good. They're going to have that deleterious trait, and it's going to hurt them or kill them or make them sick or whatever it is. It's going to weaken them in some way and be bad for their reproductive ability, bad for their survival. And that is the problem with recessives. Those types of bad, unhealthy genes can stick around because they don't hurt you in their heterozygous form. So one problem with inbreeding, like that example I just gave you, is that you are likely to pop out with these recessive genes that have been floating around, and all of a sudden you've got these animals that are weird or messed up or have something wrong with them, right? So the other issue with inbreeding, another con, I should say, is it very quickly can reduce your genetic variety, how many genes, your overall genetic diversity in your population, right? Because a sibling-to-sibling pairing already shares a lot of the same genes because they got them from the same mom and the same dad. So they're very closely related. They share a lot of the same genes. Lots of genes that are elsewhere in the population have no chance of getting into that breeding. Same with a parent-to-child breeding, or even a cousin-to-cousin, right? Lots of the genes are already shared. So your likelihood of introducing new genes into that project go way down. If you do this over and over again, you can actually lose genes altogether, especially more rare genes. So it's like you're making your population less adaptable. You're decreasing their ability to evolve. So if they're let me give you a quick example. I don't want to go too deeply into this, but it is important to understand. Let's say that the earth is getting warmer and some snake lives somewhere and they are used to a certain climate. And the climate starts to change. Maybe it gets wetter, maybe it gets warmer, right? Because obviously the climate of our planet is changing. It's changing all the time, not just in our lifetimes, but it's always changing. Animals have to be able to adapt. So sometimes you'll get an animal that has a rare gene that's not in very many of the individuals in that population that makes it so that animal has some sort of adaptation that makes it more fit for that new climate, right? Maybe it does better with water, maybe it does better with heat, whatever it may be. And so as the climate moves more and more that way, that individual is going to be very successful. His offspring that inherit that gene are going to be very successful. And you're going to go from this gene that used to be rare to becoming very, very common in the population because those individuals are the ones that are most likely to survive and most likely to reproduce. Well, if you're inbreeding constantly, those rare genes can disappear, because unless you happen to be inbreeding an animal that has that very, very rare gene, you're going to miss it, right? And so it can slowly disappear from your population. And we don't want that. We want genetic diversity. We want them to be as adaptable as possible and have as many genes in their gene pool as we possibly can. Okay? So, those are the cons. And they're real cons. All three of those, the social stigma, the deleterious recessive traits, and the lack of genetic diversity, are very real cons when working with an inbreeding group of animals. So, let's talk real quick about the pros of inbreeding, including explaining why we use it occasionally. So this is a ball python, right? Most of you who watch this vlog are ball python people, but for those of you who don't know, this is a ball python. It's a Python regius is the scientific name, from Africa. And it's a beautiful snake. However, most of you, even those of you who are not familiar with ball pythons, can tell this is probably not what ball pythons look like in the wild. You're absolutely right. It's not. This is a leopard ivory. That's what the mutations that she carries, the pigment mutations, have been named. So in a nutshell, inbreeding is often your best or even your only tool for artificial selection, right? We have some new gene that we want to produce more of, so you breed it, you hold back the offspring that show it, and you don't breed the offspring that don't show it, right? Which means the ones that you do breed are going to be related, sometimes very related. And it's not exclusive to snakes. For an example, I'm a dog person, I love dogs. Everybody on Earth probably would agree that a dog is a better pet than a wolf, which is what originally they came from. But people artificially selected for traits that they liked, right? They had their wolf. It was a little bit friendlier than most wolves, wasn't, biting them and stuff, so they bred that one. They did not breed the mean one. And then the offspring from that nice wolf also tended to be nice, or maybe they were a little cuter, had a curlier tail, floppier ears, whatever it was they wanted. And over eons, they got to the point where we have this wonderful pet today that is much friendlier, less aggressive, just overall is much more adapted to living with humans, right? And that was selected for by those humans. And I guarantee that along the lines, they used a lot of inbreeding. They bred together the individuals that were the friendliest, or whatever it was. Maybe they wanted a guard dog. And we do that in reptiles, right? We have this pigment mutation that makes this snake lighter and takes away melanin or whatever it's doing. And we want that. So we keep the offspring that show that, and we breed them together, and we get more of them. Or in this case, you get an ivory, which is even more spectacular than a regular yellow belly, right? And as long as we are not, excuse me, as long as we are not producing animals that are showing these deleterious recessive traits, which we talked about a minute ago, we're probably going to be okay, right? Ball pythons are subject to inbreeding quite frequently, and very, very rarely do I ever hear of one with, a missing tongue or whatever it may be that could be some bad problem in the snake, or heart problems, or whatever it is. They're a healthy species, right? Now let's talk about that other con and why ball pythons have an advantage. The ball python population in captivity is 1,000 times larger than the population of eastern indigo snakes in captivity, right? Which means that the overall genetic diversity of ball pythons in captivity is still very, very large. Even though some inbreeding is practiced, they're also outbred to other lines that are unrelated to them constantly, right? So you're constantly bringing in new blood into your projects. If inbreeding were completely out of the picture, you would have to, I don't know what, I don't think it would be possible to produce these animals. And I love them. They're healthy. I'm not producing animals that I feel are unhappy or less fit. They're gorgeous, well-adjusted captive animals. They do very, very well. Ball pythons in general are just very, very healthy. They seem to be resistant to some of the problems that sometimes come up with inbreeding. And that is a thing. Some species do better with it than others. And there's a lot that goes into that I don't want to talk about now because this is already becoming a very long video. But I just wanted to make it clear that some of the most impressive or useful, it's not always just for looks, but some of the most useful traits that we have in animals today owe a lot, or even completely owe their existence to inbreeding. And if you are careful and you're not overusing it so that you're constantly breeding sibling to sibling and then you get offspring and you go sibling to sibling again and you get offspring, eventually you're going to have such a high inbreeding coefficient that chances of not having some sort of bad gene in there or some sort of other problem, it gets pretty bad, right? But if you're just trying to create a new project, and once you have that project going, then you stop the inbreeding, you're going to be okay, and it really is all right. Now, I know that there is a large part of the reptile hobby that hates ball pythons, okay? Hates leopard geckos, hates corn snakes, hates retics, hates boa constrictors. And any of the reptiles that are frequently bred for their morphs, right? Their color mutations. These people are all about the naturally occurring look of the snake, the classics, right? Which also are very, very beautiful. I suspect that part of that backlash, part of that anger is because of inbreeding. They just look at these morphs and they're like, man, that wouldn't occur in nature. If it did, it would die immediately. This snake, if you stuck it out in the desert in Africa or wherever they're from, it's not going to make it. It's going to get picked off by a predator. It's going to be spotted by the rodents it's trying to hunt down. It's not going to make it, right? And so they're like, the only way to keep it going is if you just inbreed it constantly and you make more and more and more of them, and that's unnatural. I don't like it. And I think that might be part of why there's this big anger against some of the morphed out animals that I find beautiful and that honestly are just as healthy. They're wonderful animals. So I don't want to start a fight with anybody, but I think that if I were producing animals that were obviously unhealthy, obviously unhappy, not able to thrive in captivity, then yeah, a little bit of anger against me would be justified. But when I see these animals and they're thriving and they're doing great and they're wonderful captives and they're beautiful and there's so much diversity to the way you can get them to look, to me it's just a good thing. And so I'm not going to worry about the people that hate it. They're free to enjoy their normal types, and I also enjoy my normal types. I think you can have the best of both worlds here. But anyway, so that was today's episode. I just wanted to discuss inbreeding with you guys and kind of what it is, the pros and cons, and at some level, probably everyone's related at some degree. It's just that the inbreeding coefficient is so low that you might as well not be related, right? But I mean, if you're 12th cousins 7 times removed, technically you're related, right? But we don't consider that inbreeding. So I don't want anyone to think like you can be completely unrelated. That doesn't exist. When I talk about inbreeding, I really mean the really close relatives being bred together. Anyway, if you have any other questions or things that I didn't cover that I should have in an inbreeding video, or comments, or if you think inbreeding is disgusting and should be avoided at all costs, let me know why. Talk to me. I love to have these conversations. You're free to comment down below. You're free to text me, email me, whatever. I love talking about reptiles. I will talk with anybody about reptiles at any time of day. So this has been another episode of Exploring Genetics. And until next time, we're the Reptile Barn.